Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is a few glimpses of detective life. The subheadlines say, How a sleuth-hound of the law does his work, some popular misconceptions, the natural gifts required to achieve success, shadows and pinchers, how a plan of campaign is arranged, a celebrated case. It says, what is popularly known as detective work possesses almost the same fascination for youth as the stage. To unravel complicated plots, to follow the trail of some desperate criminal, to match vicious cunning with shrewdness and sagacity, and bring the enemies of society to bay, seems a glorious pursuit to the callow mind. It promises exciting adventure, good pecuniary reward, and a heaped-up measure of fame. Besides, the detective as he appears in the works of Gaborian and his imitators is the finest type of the modern hero. Keen, active, and alert, ready for every emergency, now the associate of princes, and then the boon companion of paupers, equal in knowledge and attainments to the learned men of all professions, and withal, making himself theatrically conspicuous in every station of life he chooses temporarily to adorn. Surely never was a more brilliant career presented to the wild ambition of youth. Real detective work, however, is very different to that described in sensational novels. It is easy enough for a skilled writer to construct a puzzle in criminality and find a character to solve it on lines which indicate profound sagacity and ingenuity. Many of the books bearing the names of American detectives as authors and pretending to discover the secret history of some noted crime are the work of professional writers who devise the situations, invent the detective work, and surround what was originally commonplace and repulsive with the imposing glamour of romance. I remember an instance in Chicago where the chief of a private agency engaged a newspaperman to write a story extolling his exploits in a celebrated case. This detective could not for the life of him tell of an interesting incident connected with the capture of the criminal. He left everything to the writer, who worked up an exciting plot and made the detective out to be of great skill and cunning. Not content with this advertisement of his professional astuteness, this detective afterward claimed that the story was absolutely true in every detail. He struck the author's name off the second edition and substituted his own on the title page. The man is unable to write a single sentence correctly, and yet he wonders why people laugh at his absurd pretensions of being a smart literary fellow as well as a relentless thief hunter. Adapted for the work. Now this very act showed the man to be excellently adapted by nature for his trade. The everyday detective is usually a commonplace individual, with few accomplishments and little imagination. He must be versed in the manners and habits of criminals, and that knowledge is invariably gained by frequenting their haunts and associating with them. Evil communication, as the old copybooks say, corrupt good manners, and it is not to be expected that such associations are conducive to fine sensibility or the highest grade of morals. Indeed, while a detective may be perfectly trustworthy in every other respect, he must of necessity throw all scruples of conscience to the wind in the exercise of his trade. He frequently has to worm himself into the confidence of his victims by sacred professions of friendship. Duplicity and deceit are often his trump cards. He cannot afford to be scrupulous or governed by the ordinary code of propriety. Criminals are more often caught by trickery than shrewdness, and the public, which is mainly interested in the results of his operations, rarely questions the methods employed so long as they are successful. As a professional enemy of the classes which prey upon society, the detective must fight them with every weapon at hand, regardless of the effect his methods may ultimately have on his own morals and character. It is evident, therefore, that the material of which good detectives are made does not include qualities akin to the heroic or romantic. Ordinary intelligence, a fair amount of pertinacity and pluck, a thick skin and an elastic conscience, the arts of tergiversation and dissimulation, seem to be the preliminary requisites to success. The capture of notorious criminals is rarely accomplished by the theatrical methods described in detective literature. In most instances, the perpetrator of a crime is known, and it's only necessary to keep a sharp lookout for him. Cases like that of Tascott, who dropped completely out of sight, are uncommon. 9 out of 10 men who are known to have committed crimes find their way into the hands of the authorities sooner or later. Patience, perseverance, and money, said a private detective recently, will bring the sharpest criminal to his money. These are the three prime requisites in our business. With enough of the latter, I would guarantee to find a hole in the coat of the finest gentleman in the land. This confident individual, it is but just to add, makes a specialty of domestic difficulties, wherein he often finds it remunerative to distort innocent actions into semblance of guilt. In most American cities, there is a regular detective department connected with the police force. As a rule, it is recruited from the ranks of roundsmen and patrolmen. In some respects, this system works well enough, but in others, it is open to objections. Appointments to the police force are usually the outcome of political influence, irrespective of the qualifications of the candidates. It is, however, simple enough in time to mold a good policeman out of a hod carrier or a blacksmith. But it does not follow that because a man makes a good policeman, he will, when occasion or preferment demands, show ability in the higher branches of his calling. Many officers are naturally adapted to shine as detectives, but their training is not always a forerunner of success. Shrewdness and sagacity do not follow as a sequence to an appointment. The men calculated to achieve prominence in thief catching are usually those with a natural bent for the trade, and who are ready and willing, as a sort of compensation for their success, to mingle among the class whom it is their duty to keep in check. The work of private agencies. The spread of private agencies shows that the municipal authorities do but a tithe of the detective work in this country. One of those agencies has a worldwide reputation. It has branches in several large cities and at central points in Europe. Those agencies have instructed to them most of the work connected with large corporations. They usually have men in their employ who can take positions in large mercantile establishments to watch the doings of suspected employees. The spy seldom knows why his services are required. Part of the system is to keep every operative in the dark as to the exact object of his work. Only the superintendent, who sifts the daily reports of his men and bases conclusions or future operations thereon, is given the key to the situation. This prevents disastrous leakage, a thing which almost every agency is fearful of, since the temptations of the operatives to turn an honest penny are sometimes stronger than they can withstand. It also shows the suspicion and distrust which this particular class of work engenders in the minds of those engaged therein. One of the most important branches of the detective trade is shadowing. The suspected individual is followed closely by a shadow from the time he leaves his house in the morning until he returns at night. A note is made of all his movements. The shadow does not leave his post in front of his residence until the lights are turned out at bedtime. If the case is urgent and flight is anticipated, shadows watch the doors all through the night. The shadows are graded according to circumstances. If the suspect is a businessman, the shadow is usually someone who can follow him without suspicion. He must dress and comport himself so that the victim or his friends will not be surprised to see such a person drop in at their usual haunts. It would not be prudent to have a well-dressed merchant followed around by a man in the garb of a mechanic, or someone whose manners would be evidently out of place in a first-class billiard room or saloon. Shadows frequently work in couples. One remains behind the other, ready to take up the pursuit in the event of the first thinking he is suspected. In France, the two shadows have reversible coats, extra neckwear, and hats about their person, so that they may change their appearance the moment it is believed that the victim suspects he is being watched. Often, however, in this country, the first shadow is followed by another unknown to himself, so that the agency may judge of the trustworthiness of his reports. How anyone can associate the shadow, who does 7/8 of the actual detective work, with anything grand or heroic, it is difficult to conceive. The spy has ever been an object of reproach and contumely. In war times, if he is caught, his fate is death. Notwithstanding the fact that the services are often indispensable in the capture of criminals, the shadow is frowned upon by the courts, and generally despised of men. There are tricks in the detective trade as in every other. For instance, it is simple enough when a clerk is pilfering during his employer's absence to send a man to make certain purchases of this clerk. The fact of the purchase is set forth with great minuteness in the operative's report. If the clerk suppresses the fact of the sale, his guilt is apparent. It is simple enough to search trunks, wardrobes, and bedrooms for incriminating scraps of paper. Even the shrewdest and most thoughtful of men are apt to leave some clue behind when hasty flight is imperative. I know of a case in Chicago where one of the chief operatives of a detective agency, who was wanted for a shooting affair, gave himself away by the neglect of ordinary precautions. Before leaving his lodging place, he tore up a number of letters and carelessly threw the fragments into the fireplace. It only needed a match to destroy every clue to his whereabouts, but he rushed off without applying that match. The scraps of paper were found by a rival agency and ingeniously placed together. One letter contained the address of a young lady at Cleveland, with whom the incautious detective was friendly. An operative of the rival agency was in Cleveland next day, plying the young lady with questions. He learned that the missing man was at a house on South Halsted Street. This fact was wired to Chicago. A shadow watched the house day and night until the man appeared. They struck up an acquaintance. With all the heartlessness of his class, the shadow accompanied him to a saloon, where he had previously arranged another detective should be waiting with a warrant for the man's arrest. This was a case of diamond cut diamond, and the laugh was against the imprudent operative who, in his efforts to escape, foolishly left a clue to the woman, whom the French declare is somewhere in every case. The plan of campaign. The general plan of work when some enormity is perpetrated is for the police to rake in all the suspicious characters in town and put them through the sweatbox. This was done at the time of the Snell murder. Captain Aldrich, who was then at the Des Plaines Street station, evolved the theory that thieves are always acquainted with the work of one another and never rest content after the commission of some great crime until they are assured in their own minds who did the job. So you see, said Captain Aldrich, it is a great scheme to gather in all the crooks. Some of them are sure to be acquainted with Snell's assailants, and we may be able to compel them to peach. But while Captain Aldrich's scheme did not work on this particular occasion, it remains in vogue, greatly to the terror of innocent persons scooped in by the dragnet. The sweatbox unfortunately exists in private agencies, some of which undertake to arrest suspected persons without process or warrant of law. When the chief is satisfied that his prisoner is not the man wanted, the poor fellow is bullied into signing a paper agreeing not to enter suit for illegal detention before he is given his freedom. This is a high-handed proceeding, and one which merits the severest punishment, but it is a part of the work which detectives feel obligated to do in the capture of criminals and suppression of crime. Sometimes there is an opportunity for fine work of the highest class, but even here there is no choice for adventures of the Gaborian type. A dozen men may be employed on a case, supplying separate threads of evidence which the chief weaves into a web to enmesh the criminal. I have in mind just such a case. A well-worked case. 12 years ago, a large banking institution of New York was swindled out of $60,000 on a forged check which purported to be drawn by a life insurance company in payment of a policy. The widow of the insured received the genuine check and went to the bank to cash it. Before she arrived, however, another woman had appeared, accompanied by a supposed lawyer, and drawn the money on a check. When the real widow, who was accompanied by her lawyer, presented herself at the cashier's window, that official took alarm and reported the circumstances to the bank president. It was found that the bogus check bore the same number as the legitimate check. The suspicion was formed at once that the forger had confederates either in the bank or in the insurance office. A very delicate situation at once presented itself. The bank president was inclined to believe that his cashier might have guilty knowledge of the plot. The president of the insurance company thought there was a leak in his own office. To say the least, it was curious that a woman, dressed to impersonate the widow, should get the money only a few moments before the genuine check was presented. A detective was called in and given charge of the case. His first act was to detail a man to trace the movements of the party who cashed the bogus check. Then he arranged to send a man to the bank to keep a close watch on the cashier, and another to the insurance office to ferret out whatever suspicious circumstances might exist there. Both those men masqueraded as new employees, and naturally had to be able to attend to the duties assumed. Meanwhile, two well-dressed men went round to the various shady places in New York, where women who suddenly acquire fortune easily might congregate. Another man was sent to the dressmaking and millinery establishments to ascertain who had recently purchased widow's weeds. Now, here were several men working on different branches of the case, each attending to a matter which of itself did not apparently amount to a great deal. Not one of the operatives knew the full significance of his inquiries. The controlling mind was that of the chief, who alone was manipulating the trap for the capture of the forgers. The man who traced the guilty couple's movements after leaving the bank reported that the woman had registered at a hotel the night before as from Washington. Inquiry at the capital showed that no such woman was known there, but she had left a memento at the hotel in the shape of a visiting card bearing the name of a man who was cutting quite a dash in society. This man was placed under surveillance. After a great deal of delicate work, in which half a dozen other operatives were engaged, it was ascertained that the man was a skillful forger. He was acquainted with the widow, and he had learned of her expectations in regard to the payment of the policy. He had wormed himself into the confidence of the cashier of the insurance company and found out not only that the check was to be paid that particular day, but ascertained its number. By a trick, he obtained a blank check from an engraving company and then put up the scheme of getting accomplices to impersonate the widow and her lawyer. The very audacity of the project carried it successfully through. This was a remarkable case, remarkably well handled, but it will be observed that no one man, even had he the wonderful resources of the great literary detectives, could have brought this case to a successful issue. The links in the chain of detection were forged by at least a dozen hands. To the chief was due the credit of interpreting the various reports, so as to render certain the capture and conviction of the forger. Instead of being one continual round of glory and pleasurable adventure, the career of a detective is in many respects repulsive and ignoble. It is made up of equal parts of hard work and low and vulgar trickery. The men who succeed in it often do at the expense of much that is good and honorable in life, for there is no other vocation which has so pronounced a tendency to uproot and destroy the moral nature. This article originally came from the Chicago Herald. This story came from the great state of Ohio, being reported in the Commercial Gazette of November 5th, 1891. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.